Welcome. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful evening. The weather's finally nice. My name is Marissa. I'm from the outreach department here at the library. So thank you all for coming out for this program and Still We Rise from the American Indian movement to today. So I hope you're all excited to learn some history. Before I hand it over to Heather, I want to do a few things. First, I'm going to tell you about two other upcoming events that you might like. One is Saturday, April 25th. We have Ojibwe story time. If you have any little kids in your life, they can come and learn some Ojibwe words. It's very fun, very cute. And if you are history people, which I assume that you are, Heather will be back on June 1st at 6 o'clock here for a lecture called Discovery of a New Nation, Native Nations and the Beginning of the United States. So join us for that one. And now I will read the Ann Arbor District Library's land acknowledgement, which is fairly new. So here we go. The Ann Arbor District Library acknowledges that it benefits from the colonization of Indigenous lands. The library pledges to support Indigenous people and culture through partnership with and recognition of Anishinaabeg artists, writers, teachers, and performers. Please visit aadl.org/land for more information about this land acknowledgement. And with that, I will introduce Heather, who I'm so excited is here. So Heather was inspired by a trip to Wounded Knee, South Dakota, and quickly developed a passion for Native American history. Curiosity for her own heritage led her to Wisconsin, where she researched the history of the Native American tribes of that region. Heather is a graduate of Madonna University of Michigan and holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts in U.S. History. And she currently travels and lectures on Native American history, including policy and activism. And she is also a PhD student at UW Green Bay. Where does she find the time? So welcome, Heather, and enjoy.
Thank you. Yes, where do I find the time? I don't sleep, so that's fine. So hi to everyone here, and if you're joining us online, hello. I'm really excited to talk to you guys tonight. Also, if you were coming to when this talk was originally scheduled, which was over the winter, I think it snowed, and that's why I was like, not doing this. So thank you for coming back out. Very excited. And so, yeah, if you're coming into the talk in June, which is the previous, it's funny because you're getting like the last part now. And so there's a 3-part series. So that's really exciting, though. But I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you guys on this wonderful weather outside. We know in Michigan when the sun is shining, we are excited about that. So I'm just gonna go through, I think I'm gonna talk maybe about half hour, 35, 40 minutes. I don't wanna talk too long because I like to leave plenty of time for questions and conversation. And so we're just gonna dive right in and go ahead and get started. I will say one thing, I refer to Indigenous people as Indigenous people. However, when we are talking about federal law or federal policy, Indian is used a lot. So if you hear me interswitch, that's why. As an Indigenous person, I prefer Indigenous. However, the way law and policy was written is it's federal Indian law and federal Indian policy, and you'll see the word Indian used within certain policies within the United States. So that's just a disclaimer. But we're gonna go ahead and get started. Marissa already talked about the land acknowledgement, so I'm not gonna read it. I have one for myself where covers a little bit more of the tribal nations here in Michigan. It's important to acknowledge the land that we're on. I think that is really important. And I think, the land just wasn't available, right? There were things that had to happen, and we want to acknowledge the people who were here beforehand. And actually, the photo on this slide is actually of one of my favorite places. This is my happy place. This is a picture of the Red River in Wisconsin on the Stockbridge-Muncie Reservation, just outside my uncle's cabin. If you look past the tall tree there, literally, like, if there was no writing there, my uncle's cabin would be right there. So it's super close to the water. So that's where I go to recharge and get reconnected after doing all of the busy things that I do. So again, my name's Heather. I'm a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, first-line descendant, Stockbridge-Muncie. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a historian, a consultant, a curator, a doctoral student, sister, wife, I'm all the things. I'm busy all of the time, but this is one of the things that I love to do the most, and that is to talk about our Indigenous history here and share the knowledge that I love so very much. My contact information is on the screen. Maybe you think of a question later on, after we're done. Maybe you're laying in bed tonight and at 1 a.m. you're like, oh, I forgot to ask this question. Shoot me an email, and I will get back to you and email that question. Also, if you ask me a question tonight and I don't know the answer to it, email me that as well, because I will find the answer or find where to point you to get that answer. I had a professor in undergrad who said, it is never a bad thing to say you don't know. So if I don't know, I'm going to tell you I don't know. So that's just a little bit more about me. We are going to start this. I know the presentation said 1960, but we're going to go back a little bit. And things are going to feel spotty because I'm giving you a chronological timeline here. But everything we talk about, or I talk about this evening, is going to come back to something else in the timeline. It will all make sense, I promise. But history is messy. It's not linear. There's a lot of different things. So tonight's presentation is called And Still We Rise. And why is that? Because there were policies put in place, programs put in place by the federal government that did everything that they possibly could to diminish us as Indigenous people, get rid of our nations, our governments, our language, and really decimate who we are as people and our families. And so one of the things that happened in 1958, there was this project called the Indian Adoption Project. Basically tells you what it was right there in the title. The Indian Adoption Project was at the end part of the boarding school era. And if you're not familiar with boarding schools, I do have a whole talk about that. But briefly, boarding schools were schools. They were federally run, and there were religious run boarding schools that were set up in different parts of the country where Indigenous children were sent to them to assimilate into Eurocentric society. So traditional gender roles, you maybe got a little bit of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but young women and girls learned how to be wives, and young men learned how to be husbands and farmers and really get a trade. I am the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of boarding school survivors. My grandparents went to a religiously run boarding school in Wisconsin, and my great-grandparents went to Carlisle out in Pennsylvania. So and the whole point was to separate Indigenous children from their families, because how do you change a group of people? You start with the children, and that is how you ultimately create change. Well, out of the boarding school era came the Indian Adoption Project. So it was launched, and it ran until 1967. They were aided by the prestigious Child Welfare League of North America, which was the predecessor to the Adoption Resource Exchange of North America, and they functioned from 1966 until the early 70s. Many religious organizations were involved in this project, including the Mormon Church and the Catholic Church. The Mormon Church took thousands of Navajo children and adopted them out to Mormon homes or to work on Mormon farms. The Catholic Church, which had also been running many boarding schools, would take children that were in their schools and foster and adopt them out to non-Native families, 90% of the time without the families knowing. The Indian Adoption Project was something that was funded through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We think of the BIA as an organization that is there to aid Indigenous people, and it is now, but it wasn't always. Again, the purpose of this government-funded program was assimilation, with the goal that any policy that the U.S. federal government had towards Native nations, assimilation was the goal, and the ultimate goal of it was to fix the Indian problem. The Indian problem caused by colonization, when settlers and colonizers came over and they're like, wait, there's people here, what do we do? Instead of just letting us live, they had to fix us. So most of the time, removal was not needed, was unneeded, and caused more harm than good. Children were being taken right from the school and adopted out to families. There were no what we would consider home visits done, where social workers or religious organizations would go out and look at the schools and look at where the children were living. And so because of the Indian Adoption Project, this leads to a study by the Association on American Indian Affairs. So everything we talk about is going to lead into the next thing. So there is a method to the madness. The Association on American Indian Affairs is an organization that's still around today. It is the oldest advocacy organization in the United States for Indigenous people. And the group caught wind of what was happening to Native children being taken. They conducted a national survey and found that at the time, 25 to 35% of Native children were being taken from their homes and extended families and being placed in child welfare and private adoption agencies. The hope behind the forced removal of children was that eventually tribes would disappear. And why would we want tribes to disappear? Because if tribal nations were still around, that meant the federal government had an obligation to uphold treaties that were made with tribal nations. Treaties are legal documents, they're contracts, agreements entered in by two sovereign entities, so one side being the United States, the other side being a tribal nation. And if the tribes are still around, well, you kind of have to honor those because they're legal documents. Treaties, doesn't matter what year they were signed. Doesn't matter. We still honor the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution. That treaty was signed how long ago? And it's still in effect today. So same thing goes for treaties signed with Native nations. The study also found that white families were using Native children for farm labor. As stated earlier, many times children were taken without reason. Going back to 1941, the study went back to, it was found that 85% of Native children had been taken from their homes. This was an intentional genocide that was happening, and Native children were at the center of it. So this is all happening, and there's a lot going on in Indian country. And again, it's going to seem like we're jumping around because we kind of are, and that's the way history works. But something will come out of the study and the Indian Adoption Project. So something will come. But before something comes, we have something else called the Indian Civil Rights Act, which is passed in 1968. So when we think of the 60s, I think we think of the civil rights movements, we think of the voting rights movement, we think of second wave feminism, LGBTQ activism, and all of that. And the American Indian movement, which we will also talk about briefly. But prior to the Indian Civil Rights Act, Indigenous folks are placed in a unique position when it comes under federal law and the Constitution. So before the passage of the Indian Civil Rights Act, the Supreme Court made it clear that tribal internal affairs concerning tribal members' individual rights were not covered by the Fifth Amendment. And that is the amendment that covers double jeopardy and self-incrimination. So if you ever see someone testifying and they're asked a question and they say, I plead the Fifth, that is against self-incrimination. But in the same breath, tribes were subjugated to the power of the Congress and the Constitution. So they're saying these rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, don't necessarily apply to tribal nations. However, you guys are still subjugated to the power of Congress and the Constitution. So it doesn't make sense. So just like any other government, there was corruption within tribal governments. People always will go, well, were tribal governments corrupt? I'm like, yes, any form of government. Even your 8th grade class government is corrupt in some way, shape, or form. So there was corruption within tribal governments, and sometimes you didn't receive the full benefits of the Bill of Rights. With the passage of the Indian Civil Rights Act, tribal members now had full access to the Bill of Rights. Tribal courts have to afford due process and enforce other civil liberties. So anything guaranteed to you, speedy trial, all of that, it's guaranteed. There are some differences, though, between the Bill of Rights and the Indian Civil Rights Act. While it guarantees freedom of religion, it does not stop tribes from establishing a religion, and it understands that many tribes do not separate religion from government and other areas of life. Remember the religious part, because that's going to come into play in just a little bit. It also guarantees a criminal defendant the right to an attorney at the defendant's expense, but a tribe does not have to provide an attorney if the defendant cannot afford one. So if you go to court outside of tribal courts, you are guaranteed the right to an attorney. if not, one will be assigned to you, a public defender. That is not guaranteed in tribal courts. And the third is there is no right to a jury trial in civil cases under the Indian Civil Rights Act. So it's really interesting because some things apply and some things don't, but for majority of the things that are there, majority things do apply. In '68, we also have something else happening. We have the formation of the American Indian Movement. AIM, as it was known, American Indian Movement, and that name was given on purpose because they were aiming for something, was formed in Minneapolis, Minnesota in July of 1968. Minneapolis has been in the news a lot this year, and part of that I was actually interviewed by a couple of podcasts and USA Today, because during the protests that were happening in Minneapolis, AIM was out patrolling the streets again to protect their communities because Indigenous people were being detained by ICE. Even when tribal governments were coming out and saying, hey, these are enrolled members of our tribe, what's going on? So Franklin Street in Minneapolis is a very historic and prominent street from the American Indian Movement, predominantly Indigenous neighborhood, and AIM was out again patrolling those neighborhoods. And so I got to speak to the history of AIM a little bit, which was really cool, but also like really sad because we were explaining it because there was something very horrific going on. But again, founded in Minneapolis in July of 1968. Some of the main names that you might know would be Dennis Banks, Clyde Bellecourt, and Russell Means. So Dennis Banks is from Minnesota. He went to boarding schools. When he was 19, he joined the Air Force. He struggled with substance use and crime, and in 1966, he went to prison. There, he met Clyde Bellecourt, who was born on the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota, who also attended boarding schools. He ended up getting in trouble with the law and went to prison as well. He and Dennis Banks meet. They form AIM. When they get out, they meet with Russell Means, who was born on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And in 1968, Russell Means begins his work with AIM, and he rises pretty quickly as a spokesperson in the group. If you are looking at photos of AIM, the most prominent person you see most of the time in the photos is Russell Means. So the group was formed to address the issues of the urban Indian within our cities. Those issues came to prominence because of the 1956, I was going to say Indian Removal Act, but it wasn't that. It was Indian relocation. But I guess you could kind of call it removal. Relocation was a policy that was formed to not necessarily push Indigenous people off reservations, but it made it very, very hard for you and more difficult to stay on reservations. They wanted you to go to the cities. They wanted you to go to Minneapolis, Denver, New York, Detroit, Houston, LA, and find jobs. Go out there, find jobs, we're gonna help you, it's gonna be great, it's gonna be awesome. It wasn't. It was not great and it was not awesome. Poverty reached an all-time high between Indigenous communities during this time. It was hard to find homes that were not in areas that were targeted for urban renewal. You were redlined, you were discriminated against, your children had to go to segregated schools. But one of the good things, I guess, so to speak, that came out of that is a lot of us realized we have the same issues, but we have the same goals. And so that's where the American Indian Movement came into play. And so they focused on the plight of the urban Indian who were forced to leave reservations. They were instrumental in organizing mass protests across the country to raise awareness to issues within Indian country. They were also very good at using the media to cover their causes and get their point across. So I'll briefly tell you about some of their massive protests that they had, if you were not familiar with them. The first was the occupation of Alcatraz, which was in 1969. Before that, if you're not familiar with, or you are familiar with, it was a prison. It closed in 1963. It was lobbied for a long time to use the island and the buildings on the island to create like an urban Indian center, a museum, a school. Richard Oakes, who was Mohawk, said, quote, "If a one-day occupation by white men on Indian land years ago established squatter rights, then a one-day occupation of Alcatraz should establish Indian rights to the island." So on November 20th, a group of 89 indigenous people sailed to Alcatraz and set up basically their own little community. There they set up a nursery, a school. They had a police force that they dubbed the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs, which is a play on the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They patrolled the island. John Trudell, a great artist, poet, joined the protest and broadcast under the radio banner of Radio Free Alcatraz. Many supported the protesters, and they were shipping supplies to the island. They did try to negotiate with the federal government. Nixon refused to listen to them, which is not surprising. And they made the front page of the news like almost every day because this protest went on from November 1969 to June 1971. It was a really long time. And they were able to bring awareness to some of the things that were going on. Another protest was a cross-country protest, which was the Trail of Broken Treaties, which was in 1972. It was a cross-country caravan, and the goal of it was to bring awareness to the broken treaties that were going on, citing the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. It was also to bring awareness to living standards, inadequate housing. 8 groups joined the American Indian movement. The caravan started on the West Coast and ended in Washington, D.C., where they took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs building to get their point across. They created a platform paper that had 20 different points on it. The Nixon administration, again, refused to meet with the protesters. After a week, the protest ended with negotiations by the protest leaders and officials from the Nixon administration, who, among other things, promised to include indigenous people in future treaty negotiations. I would like to point out, though, that the United States stopped making treaties with indigenous nations in 1871. So everything else by then was done by an act of Congress, but they thought that this would be something that would suffice. Another major protest they did was the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973. If you're not familiar with Wounded Knee, there was a massacre that happened at Wounded Knee in 1890, December of 1890, where numbers vary. I think it's safe to say 250 to 300 unarmed Lakota were murdered by the 7th Cavalry, who had previously been decimated years before at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So some would argue that the massacre at Wounded Knee was payback for that. But in 1973, the Pine Ridge Reservation ran high in corruption. Many leaders, including Dennis Banks, sought out the leadership of the traditional leaders on the reservation and said, "We're here to help. What can we do?" They said, help us get our tribal chairman, Dick Wilson, at the time, out of office. Make your stand here at Wounded Knee. So on February 27th, 1973, the occupation of Wounded Knee began. There was gunfire every single day, every single night. There weren't a lot of casualties. In fact, there were less than 6 casualties, which is really, that's a good thing, but there was nightly fire every night. After 71 days, the occupation ended. The violence on the reservation, though, didn't end. And there were several murders of people after the occupation, which could be a whole other talk within itself, that were believed to have been ordered by the tribal chairman, whose name was Dick Wilson, who was awful to the people on the reservation. And so the whole point was that to bring not only awareness, but they wanted an independent state. They wanted the Oglala Lakota Nation, which is the one housed on Pine Ridge, to be independent, so much so that they demanded a meeting with the Secretary of State to be recognized as a sovereign nation. That did not happen. In 1975, you have the Self-Determination Education Assistance Act. This policy was introduced under Nixon, but Ford signed the act on January 4th, 1975, because Nixon was preoccupied with other things, having to leave office. The act officially ended the policy of termination, which was an act that was put into place in 1954, where the federal government, in order to solve poverty on tribal reservations, basically abolished, terminated the idea that tribal nations existed. And they're like, oh, we're just, not going to recognize you as tribal nations anymore. You guys are going to be treated like everybody else. It's going to be great. However, when the federal government did that, it then cut off and took away funding to health programs, schools, all of that. And so tribal nations who were already struggling now struggled even more. So this act officially ended that policy of termination. It allowed the federal government to contract with tribal governments for federal services. The BIA at first was resistant to the act and wanted to retain control over tribal affairs and how the money was spent. But over time, and with increased pressure from the tribes, the BIA slowly started to lessen its hold over tribal affairs, and tribes were able to apply for and receive grant funding. So this is where we kind of see the switch in the Bureau start to happening to actually work towards tribal nations, work with them. The act also gave control over indigenous schools back to the tribes, where native language was reintroduced. And it might seem like a small thing, it might seem like it's something that's insignificant, but our language is part of our culture. And when you introduce the language back, the culture comes back. And that is really, really important. So the fact that tribes were able to gain control over the tribal schools and not only introduce language again, but introduce the teachings of our cultures, introduce ceremony teachings again. That is huge. That is a revitalization of who we are as indigenous people. Self-determination gave tribal nations the opportunity to gain control over their tribal governments again, including economic development and natural resource rights. That part is so important, the natural resource rights. The fight for natural resources in this country in general is very volatile and very, it's something I think we think about every day. And even though reservation lands only make up 2% of the land population in the United States, if you took all the reservation land, all the missions, all the rancheros, they would all fit in the state of Idaho. But if you look at the amount of natural resources on reservations, it is well into the billions of dollars worth of natural resources that is protected because it's reservation land. So the fact that we gained our natural resource rights back, that is huge because that gives us the opportunity to protect the land. If you ever have heard about the Navajo and Hopi reservations in the Southwest and the problems with the uranium mining that went on, contaminated the water. There are very few homes on Navajo that have access to clean water because of the mining for the natural resources that happens. And the fact, I will say this too, under the first Trump administration, there was talk about privatizing reservations to gain access to the natural resources. And that is something that we don't want that to happen. Number one, those are our lands, and number two, we should be protecting our land, air, and water. And so having the natural resource rights back is important. In many ways, though, self-determination helped tribes gain back their federal government or tribal government again, which leads to the implementation of tribal courts and economic development. This is where we start to see tribes being able to make contracts with the federal government, get grants to start putting infrastructure into the nations. That's important because economic growth helps a tribal nation be able to, build schools, create jobs. Like, that's important for us. And so this act was really important. So at the very beginning of this, we talked about the Indian Adoption Project. We're coming full circle now. Because in 1978, we have something called the Indian Child Welfare Act that's passed, also known as ICWA. So if I say ICWA from now on out, that's what I'm talking about. So that report that we talked about, the Association on American Indian Affairs report that we talked about at the beginning, seeing what was happening, and Native nations were reporting that their children were literally missing. The crisis was affecting Native families and tribes. And in response to this, Congress listened, they heard us, and enacted the Indian Child Welfare Act. And it is looked at as the way to protect the interests of Native children and best and promote the stability and security of Native nations. Congress looked at all the studies that were done, and they were able to identify 4 reasons why there were high rates of Native children being removed. Number 1 was the lack of culturally competent state and child welfare standards for assessing the fitness of Indian families, meaning that non-Native social workers didn't understand Indigenous culture and didn't make an attempt to. They walked in, saw something that was foreign to them, and decided that it was wrong. Number 2, systematic due process violations against Native children and their parents in custody hearings. Parents, family members, and tribes were not being notified of court proceedings. So often they didn't know when to show up to court. So they would miss a court date because they didn't know about a court date and they were deemed unfit. The third was economic incentives. Favoring the removal of the children, meaning that the government, mainly the Bureau of Indian Affairs, was literally paying social workers to take children from their homes. And the fourth reason was social conditions in Indian country. They were poor and underfunded communities. On the outside, reservations didn't look like good places to live, even though children were consistently surrounded by communities. So again, it's this non-Native people looking in and seeing only what they see on the outside and not seeing literally what's happening on the inside, that children are surrounded by community, by family, by love, by culture and tradition. So in 1978, against actual opposition from church groups, several states, and social welfare groups, Jimmy Carter signs ICWA. And it sets a minimum federal standard for nearly all Native children custody proceedings. This includes adoption, voluntary and involuntary termination of parental rights, and removal and foster placement of children. ICWA also provides that states do not have jurisdiction over adoption or custody hearings of Native children residing on reservations. ICWA was also there to help families and tribes address a long list of atrocities that have been committed over the years. So now, when placing children, caseworkers have to consider 4 things: providing active efforts to the family, identifying placement that falls under the qualifications laid out in the act, notifying the child's tribe and parents of when custody hearings are, and working actively to be involved with the child's tribe and parents in court proceedings. It also sets forth a unique relationship that tribal nations have within the United States. Native people are not classified by race, but rather as political entities, because they are part of sovereign nations, and that the United States recognizes that. Native nations should have a say in what happens to their children. And that very reason is why ICWA has actually been challenged more times than the Affordable Care Act. Non-Native people challenge ICWA at a rate that is so high, it is ridiculous. And there was actually just a Supreme Court case not that long ago, like within the past 5 years, that challenged ICWA. And the Supreme Court, and I will say surprisingly, upheld ICWA and said, no, it is constitutional. They left the door open for it to be challenged again, but right now ICWA is safe, and it actually sets one of the gold standards for placing children, Native children in homes. I am friends with a few social workers, Native social workers to be exact, and they're like, it's the best thing out there. It's so precise as about to place children. And so we're coming full circle again to another thing. When we talked about the Indian Civil Rights Act, I talked about how you had the right to practice your religion, but you kind of really didn't until 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. Before colonization, tribes practiced a number of different religions, but due to the United States being the way that they were in Native policies, they banned a lot of our ceremonies. And so in 1978, again, Jimmy Carter signs this act giving us access to be able to practice our religions. It guarantees 4 things. Number 1, the ability to practice traditional ceremonies in our homes, public places, and prisons. Access to ceremonial sites, whether they are on reservation or not, use and possession of ceremonial sacred objects, and freedom to worship through ceremonial and traditional rites. This act is also considered a catalyst for the 1990 passage of the Native American Graves Protection Act, which we will talk about in a little bit. In 1980, there was a Supreme Court case with the Lakota people, Lakota nations, suing the United States government for their right to have the Black Hills back. The Black Hills are a part of, they're a small little like mountain range. They're hills, mountains, they're like in between, in South Dakota on just outside the Pine Ridge Reservation that were guaranteed to them in the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. Well, shortly after that treaty was signed, a man by the name of George Armstrong Custer leads an expedition into the Black Hills in 1874, and in that expedition, they find gold. And so he reports back, hey, we found gold in them hills, and reports that out. And so the federal government was like, I know we promised this to you guys, but we're gonna kind of like take these to get the gold out. And so the Lakota protest, obviously, because the treaty, and starting in like 1920, they start court proceedings against the federal government, and this goes on for a very, very, very long time. So on October 17th, 1979, the Solicitor General Wade McCree sent an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, appealing lower courts' rulings. This went back and forth. The Lakota sometimes won, they sometimes lost, so it finally gets all the way to the Supreme Court in a court case called the United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians. It was argued March 24th, 1980. The Supreme Court ruled that the Black Hills had in fact been stolen, and it ruled 8-1 to uphold the ruling of the Court of Claims, which ruled just that. The court affirmed that the Lakota had never received just compensation. The court went on to recognize that Congress wears 2 hats, benevolent trustees for Indians and the power to take their land. The court ruled that Congress cannot wear both hats at the same time. The only dissenting justice, William Rehnquist, disagreed with the original order of the Court of Claims in 1942, which he believed was wrong, and he thought that the Lakota had already been justly compensated. It would be fair to say that the dissent of Rehnquist suggests that it would be unfair to judge by the light of revisionist historians something that happened a century ago. The Lakota sued to get the land back. That is what they wanted. They did not get the land back. Instead, the Supreme Court said, we're going to pay you more and we're going to give you interest. So $106 million plus interest. Today, that would be over $1.5 billion. The Lakota refused the money. They said it wasn't about the money, it was about the land. So that money is still sitting in the treasury because the Lakota are like, no, absolutely not. The whole point was to have the land back. And I think that is absolutely huge. That's a whole other thing that we could get into a lot of detail on. So something I mentioned earlier, which was NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, was passed in 1990. And it was passed in 1990, and then there were new regulations that went into effect in 2024. So what is NAGPRA? Why is it needed? How does the law work? NAGPRA requires any institution that accepts federal funds to make inventory of that and start to return, make inventory of objects or human remains that they have that are indigenous and return said human remains and objects. Why is it needed? NAGPRA requires federal agencies and institutions receiving federal funds, like museums, to identify, inventory, and repatriate indigenous cultural items in their collection. It's needed because of this right here, this slide right here. The amount of indigenous remains within institutions, whether they're academic or cultural museum institutions, is ridiculous. The University of California, Berkeley has 4,700 indigenous remains. Harvard has 5,400, and the American Museum of Natural History has at least 1,700, at least. There is a report by ProPublica that you can go online and look at. It is ridiculous to see the amount of at least remains that are have. And some of the argument for these institutions to have remains is that for research. Okay, that doesn't really sit well with me, but if we just take you wanting human remains for research, great. When you are done with said research, you should return said remains, right? Seems very simple, seems super, super simple, but there are institutions that refuse to do it. With the new regulations that were passed in 2024, there was a classification where you could use culturally unidentifiable. In 2024, the new regulations said, no, you can't do that, because they found that museums, cultural institutions, academic institutions were using that as a way to get out of being able to return remains. Like, oh, we can't identify it, so we're gonna keep it. No, the new regulations say you absolutely have to apply identification to them and return them. And I've worked in NAGPRA since 2019, and it's it's a lot of hard work sometimes, but it is very rewarding when we are able to receive our ancestors and our culturally significant objects and return them to the ground where they belong, which is really, really great. So there is a reason it's needed. So when people are like, why do we need NAGPRA? This is why, because there are institutions out there holding our ancestors, doing nothing with them, but letting them sit on shelves, right? Not letting them rest. I'm gonna quickly go through the next couple of slides. Standing Rock was a huge, huge, huge protest that happened between 2016 and 2017. It was in response to the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the Dakota Access Pipeline was a pipeline that was going to go under the Missouri River, did go under the Missouri River, which is a large drinking source and water source for not just indigenous folks, but millions of people living in and around that area. And so there were protests that were started to stop that. And it was going through sacred burial grounds. The Army Corps of Engineers, they're not all bad, but these ones were really bad. And they were not understanding and hearing, they were not following proper protocol in terms of working with tribal nations to make sure that they weren't going through burial sites, and they just started digging. And they did hit burial sites. And so I think that's important to talk about, and I think that gives us to another reason why later on in 2020 and now we have this movement called Land Back. Because if you think about it, and I will make this argument, if we had understood and listened to the Lakota people and other tribal nations who were at those protests, I think Standing Rock would have still been an issue, but I don't think it would have been, because Land Back talks about 4 different campaign demands. And so it is a campaign that talks exactly like it is, land back, returning land back to indigenous people. But there are 4 things that they talk about when they talk about land back. And I want you to hear these and think about what happened at Standing Rock. So the first is to dismantle white supremacy structures that forcefully remove us from our lands and continue to keep our people in oppression. And this includes organizations such as the Bureau of Land Management and the National Parks. What? The National Parks? What's wrong with them? It's indigenous land. If you've heard me here before, I have come here and talked about the national parks and how they're not necessarily problematic, but it was a violent start to the national park system. The national parks also house sites of cultural significance and religious significance to indigenous people. The Bureau of Land Management, I have never seen so much land in my life that fell under the Bureau of Land Management than when I drove through Montana like a few years ago. Like legit, number one, that state is huge. But number two, like the grazing land for cattle and all of that is Bureau of Land Management land, which means it's land we don't have access to. Why don't we have access to it? Because it was taken from us. And why was it taken from us? For cattle, for ranches. Not saying that is not important, but good gravy. So it's talking about, how can we, get this back. The second is to defund white supremacy and mechanisms and systems that enforce it and disconnect us from the stewardship of our land. This includes police, the military-industrial complex, border patrol, and ICE. Boundaries, state lines, boundary lines, those are colonial constructs. Right? There's this, like, you drive from Michigan to Ohio, the land looks the same. The only thing that changes maybe is the speed limit, but it looks the same, right? There are reservations that cross our northern border and our southern border. And because of institutions like Border Patrol and ICE, that stops us from being able to steward our land in the way that we should be able to. The third is very simple. Very, very simple, and it shouldn't be scary. It might sound scary, but it's not scary. Return all public lands to Indigenous hands. I would like to reemphasize public lands, not the land your house is on. Live in your house, I want you to be happy, but public lands, right? Or at least allow us to be in stewardship of them with, like, maybe the National Park Service, right? Maybe we can all come together, have a moment, and, work together on stewardship of the national parks. And the fourth is consent. Moving us out of an era of consultation and into a new era of policy around free and prior informed consent. Consultation tells me that you've already made a decision about something, whether you're the Army Corps of Engineers or somebody else, and you're gonna work in consultation with the tribal nation because our bad, we did something and now we wanna make it right. But free and prior informed consent puts us in the driver's seat with you from the very beginning, which is why I say that if there had been free and prior informed consent when it came to Standing Rock and Dakota Access Pipeline, would it have still been a thing? Absolutely, but would it have been as big and awful as it was? Probably not. Because we would have been involved from the start. If they had listened, if the Army Corps of Engineers had listened and worked with the tribal nation from the beginning, I feel like we would have had a very, very different outcome. And we are still living with the ramifications of Standing Rock today because, I know they don't like to talk about this, but that pipeline has leaked. The minute oil started flowing through, it has leaked already. Federal judges have shut it down at one point already. There's the same reason there was a big fuss over the Keystone Pipeline, because those things are leaked, right? You can't put them in the middle of our farms, in the middle of our water supplies, in the middle of all of that, because they are not safe. And so even though, we've experienced all of these things, we're still here because we've risen to the occasion every time we have had to. When Standing Rock happened, we were there. When the land back movement started, we were there. When our communities and things were feeling threatened in the 1960s, we were there, and we are still there now. We are still there in 2026. It's an election year. We're going to be out there because when we mobilize as Indigenous people and as voters, we can sway elections. We've done it before. We've done it in Montana. We've done it in Wisconsin. It can happen. And so I think it's important to, understand that we're still here and we still rise up to the occasion. So the educator in me would not be happy unless I gave you something that you maybe wanted to use as homework or whatever your heart says. A lot of these are books on here. Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, Lakota Woman. I love Lakota Woman. That was such a great read. It's written by Mary Crow Dog. She was at the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Troyer. I'm going to give my own little plug, but my day job, I work at the Henry Ford Museum, and in November, we are welcoming David Troyer to come, so please check that out. The Rediscovery of America by Ned Blackhawk. Love that book. Love Ned Blackhawk. He's really funny. If you want to learn more about Land Back, there's their website. Trudell is a documentary all about John Trudell. I think it's great. Awake, A Dream from Standing Rock is also a documentary, which is also wonderful. But if you're more of like a podcast person and you want to learn more about the American Indian movement, the Revolutionary Left podcast, it's a series. So you have to go in, search the American Indian movement, and you will find a 2.5-hour episode on the American Indian movement. It's brilliant. They interview Nick Estes, great indigenous historian. And so with that, I talked way longer than I thought I was going to. So sorry, that's the historian in me that rambles. But I will, we have time for a few questions. So if you have a few questions, please ask. Before I forget, thank you guys for coming out on this beautiful evening to spend a little bit of time with me. And I'll take a couple questions and we'll go from there. So thank you guys so much.
And I do have a mic, if that's helpful for folks. Although I know small groups, sometimes people just shout on out.
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering, how did universities end up with so many Indian remains in the first place?
That's a great question. So it's funny because one of the main answers to that is actually research. So back before archaeology and things were more regulated, people would just go out into the field to where they thought that there were burial sites and do a dig and gather the remains that way to learn more about a civilization that had passed. And so that's how most of the remains ended up in universities. I know, it's weird, but that's pretty much how they got there. Yes. More questions, comments, concerns? Yes.
I'm just a little curious, I'm sure it's changed over the decades, but as far as the lawyers representing indigenous peoples' rights and concerns, for the most part, were they Native American lawyers, or like what was the training and specializing and problems or positives about the representation that the tribes got for I think it differs case by case.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's any more.
Yeah, so there are definitely more Native lawyers around today than there were previous. I would have to, if I made an educated guess, I would assume that there were some, but not a lot, because again, you were discriminated against, right? So you weren't. It wasn't easy to get into Harvard Law School or Yale Law School. Were there Native lawyers, in the early 1900s? Absolutely, but they were probably far and few in between. I know the lawyers that did take the case for the Lakota people when they were suing to get the Black Hills back were non-Native lawyers, who understood. And also, federal Indian law is bless you. It's complicated. And not taught in every law school. I do know that they teach some of it, bless you, at U of M, but I do know Michigan State has a good federal Indian law program. A lot of the universities out west, specifically in the Southwest, do, but it's a very specialized area, and it's also very difficult to understand. I have some friends who've gone to law school and done federal Indian law who have even said, I'm studying it, and I still am just what are you talking about? Because it's just very complicated because none of it makes sense. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I have so many questions and comments. When I was in college, this was many years ago, I worked with a professor who taught an American Indian law class for undergrads. And he had some of us volunteer to a case he was working on to try and get a tribe in the Northeast recover some land. I went to, during spring break, I went to the American Indian Museum in New York City because that's
Yeah.
originally where I'm from, and, to try and find records where they were referred to prove that they did exist on that land, and, they had to have like some kind of record, but who's gonna keep records, and that too, what was their purpose of keeping the records? I mean, even if people kept records, well, obviously it's the white settler who kept the records, but what was their purpose, what was their intention? But it was good that they kept the records in any case so that we could prove the case, that they did exist, the Abenaki did exist in this area,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was very, very frustrating. But the question of remains, I'm wondering, like, the cynic in me, and I'm not trying to cop out, in terms of like, it's a defeated purpose, no. But like, for instance, years ago when I was traveling with my parents, when they were alive, we took a trip to South America, and, just like in America, I think it's even worse in South America, quite frankly, how, like, when you're on a tour, they completely whitewash their experiences with indigenous peoples and the history of indigenous peoples there. Just like here, actually, they're almost completely, not completely, but so many tribes are wiped out, and if they're referred to, it's kind of derogatory, or extremely derogatory. I mean, they even showed us a cage where they took like a family of indigenous people back to Europe in a cage, in a ship, back to Europe, and this was in the 19th century, not even in the 16th century or something, but in the 19th century, and they were kept in that cage. And I'm wondering if they kept the remains, maybe because they were still at that point of like trying to do research on like the racialization of, like the Darwinian theory of race, and were they of a, because race we know now doesn't exist in that sense, but at that time in scientific minds it did. Was that part of the purpose, or was it also, and this is even more cynical, so that these remains were not allowed to rest in their final place of rest, you could say, and so those tribes could not claim that this is a final resting place, you cannot disturb it. Do you see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I do. I think
That's very cynical of me, I know.
I mean, it's not. Well, it like isn't. It isn't. Do you know what I mean? Like, okay. So I feel like. Yes,
Like
I feel like.
Circuitous way to seize land.
Oh, totally. Everything that has happened in this country has been about land. Every argument, every fight, the American Revolution. It wasn't about freedom. It was about land. And so I do see what you're saying, and I don't necessarily find fault with it. Like if I'm thinking, like, making an educated guess or thought about it, I definitely feel like, yeah. Yeah, no, totally, absolutely. I don't feel like you're making an excuse. And I will say though too, I see some substance in what you're saying in terms of like the studying of, the research of, because when the Dawes Act was passed in 1887, the federal government sent out anthropologists to different reservations to determine how Indian you were. So they measured the size of your nose, how far apart your eyes were. It was like, so the size of your forehead. Yes. So I see what you're saying, and I could very much see that as a reason. I could see that as a reason. Like, they're like, oh, let's study these exotic people. Like, yeah. So, like, if yeah. And I don't feel like it's excuse making. It's, but when we look at it today, it's wrong still, yeah. Yeah, totally. So, I mean, I don't actually see a flaw in what you're saying. And I don't think you're making an excuse. No, but that's a great question. Great, yeah. So, yeah, definitely. Yes.
Can you talk more about trying to get back ceremonial places? If there are any cases that are in Michigan hereabouts?
Are you talking about
Access to sites?
Yeah. So the land back movement has actually been really instrumental in having sites of significance returned back. So I don't know, because it didn't really like make the news, but like in Detroit, there was a burial mound that's at Fort Wayne that was given back to the Potawatomi last year or the year before. I can't remember. So that's happened there across the country. There have been other important sites that have been gone back. There was some land that the Minnesota Historical Society had that was it was significant during the Dakota Uprising of 1862, and that was, it went through the Minnesota legislature, but it was given back to the lower Sioux agency. There was some land in New York. Also, there was about 1,000 acres, I think, that was given back to the Onondaga, that also had sites of significance that were related to it. So it is something that's happening. It doesn't make news. I don't know why it doesn't make news. I think it's so important. And actually, I feel like just last week, there was something again in New York. Or was it Canada? I don't remember, but it had something to do with the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy. So there was another, they just gained some land back in upstate New York. So we're, I think, around like the Buffalo area, and they were able to get some land back, and that land actually now is gonna, I believe, house a cultural center, like so a significant cultural center, which is gonna be like really exciting and really cool. So it is something that's happening, and there are examples of it happening. It's just, there's not a lot. But what's really great is that it's happening in different forms. So whether it's private ownership, whether it's using policy like state legislatures or federal legislatures, there hasn't been much federal land given back yet, and I don't think we're going to see that for a little while. But there have still been pushes to have that back. But we do have access to cultural sites and significant sites within national parks. That was part of the Indian Religious Freedom Act. And so there are, because I don't practice any of those ceremonies, I don't know the whole red tape of it all that you have to go through. But I do know that there's you go through certain paperwork or permissions, and you're able to get access to practice your ceremony or your religion in national parks, in significant sites. So it is happening, which is, I think, really exciting. So I think we could do one more question, because I don't want to keep you guys, because it's 7 p.m. on a school night. So yes.
So it's not a question, but I just looked at ProPublica's University of Michigan lists over 700 human remains.
Yeah.
Not repatriated.
Yeah.
How many?
Over 700.
At U of M.
Yes.
Yeah, U of M is a little problematic in that area as well.
But it's probably much, you're claiming it's much more?
What was that?
That's just the human remains. Oh, that's not culturally.
That's not cultural objects or artifacts.
Because I remember you mentioned Harvard and UC Berkeley and the Museum of Natural History in New York, but are you claiming that they are actually holding a lot more than what they're claiming?
The ones I talked about, that is what they're reporting out. We know, though, Harvard is a bit worse. Harvard and UC Berkeley are the worst of the worst. It might not necessarily be in numbers, but I know Harvard for a fact is the worst in actually just dealing with them. They're awful. Because
they're Harvard.
Because they're Harvard, right? And so, yeah, they're not very easy to deal with. And in fact, the first repatriation that I did when I was working in NAGPRO was in 2019, and I did it with a very large natural history museum in the Midwest along the shores of Lake Michigan. And and I wanted to reach across the desk and smack this woman because she didn't want to culturally identify, I think, 200 of the remains that we were going to be taking home, and then tried to give me an education on archaeology and the ice ages. And I was like, girlfriend, I don't need that. Our oral histories and maps show us that these are, such and such ancestors. We know that there were burial grounds in this area. They were not the best to work with. Luckily, now someone I know works in that department, and they're getting a little better. But museums are not the greatest to deal with. And I work in museums. And they're not the best to deal with. But Harvard is awful. They don't even want to give you the time of day. So.
It's usually the smaller museums and the more regional, smaller museums that will have a lot of a lot of information, they'll be a lot more generous with it. That's just.
They have
my-
been. In my experience, it's the smaller institutions that are literally like, and I'm an institution as well. We don't have human remains, but we have objects of cultural significance, and we're just like, will somebody answer the phone so we can give you your stuff back? Like, we are like begging. But because we don't have human remains, we're actually a little lower on the list, because the remains you want to get back first. That's the most important. And yes, 100%. But in the same breath, we're like, we want to give everything back. Like, we just want everything to go back. So, but yeah, but thank you guys so much for coming tonight. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in June.